Thank you so much. My name is Tiziana Alocci. I'm an information designer. I work with data. And today I'm going to tell you a story. But in order to do so, I'm going to start playing a sound. What you just heard is a data set showing the sea level rise in the past 10 years. The data have been collected by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. I then use a tool to interpolate the data with a music instrument and to create this sound. So the data visualized in a normal chart looks like this. So this is called data sonification. And today I'm going to explain why this is important. Just to give you a bit of context, this is what I do. I am an information designer. I teach data visualization at the University of Arts in London, where I live. And sometimes I play with data art, but more in general, I play with sound. When we talk about data, it's always a kind of abstract topic, so no one really understands what actually my job is. I like to say that I collect data, I communicate visually, facts, and story based on information. And I've been visualizing data for more than a decade now, and I specialize in data visualization for digital products, such as dashboards, things like that, things that you cannot really see online, because most of these works are under NDA, and they're used internally for a company. So it's a very corporate. And I shouldn't say that because my clients could see that, but kind of, I mean, not so funny, but pays the bill. And, inflation is real. So I also collaborate with magazines like Wired UK and the Italian newspaper Corriere della Sera to make more editorially driven visualization. And they look a little bit more complex because we try to tell stories. And every data set has a story behind. But in the last 3 years, I started to play a lot with sound. And that has become a little bit of my obsession. So there is this new niche area of data visualization called data sonification. And the definition is the use of non-speech audio to convey information or perspectualize data. And I must admit that I reappropriate this definition in my own practice. So I'm doing something that it's not really what I'm supposed to do. So some of the more purist data visualization designer may raise their eyebrows. Apologize. So data sonification applies in my 9 to 5-ish job. In a very important way, because working for specializing data visualization for digital products means that using sound to visualize data adds another layer to make everything more accessible. So think about a dashboard that shows you information. If you add a layer of sound to convey this information, it could make life easier to blind people, for example. Then there is all the part linked to the data art that I work that is a little bit of my lifeline and my necessity, and is where I go to just ease my mind and produce things that that makes me feel better. So when I work with data, producing data artworks, I focus translating sound into an image, while the traditional data sonification is about translating a data set into a sound. That we are always talking about translating something. So data storytelling is a very important part of data visualization. And it differs from it because it requires communicator to offer a more broader and more holistic view of their message. And these, for example, are 2 data-driven album covers that represent 2 waveforms that comes from 2 songs included in each of these vinyl records. And these are electronic and techno music tracks. So in order to make these very abstract visuals a little bit more relatable with my audience, what I do is playing a lot with visual analogies. And I take inspiration from nature, mainly, and but inspiration can come from pretty much everywhere. So what looks abstract, in reality, is a kind of copy of what we already see, like a jellyfish or a volcano, for example. So Mark mentioned that I have a magazine. I run an independent magazine that I co-founded in 2016. It's the first world independent magazine about data visualization, and it's a really work of love. It's printed in a very small, limited amount of copy, all that numbered, and it's all the work between me and the other half of the magazine, Piero Zagami. And so we publish around one issue a year. We focus the magazine on different themes. And the last one, the theme of the last one was data beyond Black Mirror. Black Mirror is intended as our smartphone, but also the screen of our laptop, our TV, because we wanted to see if it was possible to experience data beyond its screen. So the screen is a kind of medium now, is between us and the information that we want to receive, and pass through one of our 5 senses, which is sight. But what about all the others? So we have smell, sight, touch, hearing, and taste. But with data visualization, we focus very much on sight. And don't get me wrong, because of course, 99% of the work that I do, it's very, can only be experienced with eyes. But data are just another tool, another instrument to make us see something that before was invisible to our eyes. So what I try to do is to creating stories, creating meaningful stories from data, which is one of the sentences that I like the most to describe the discipline of data visualization. But since stories, of course, need an audience to exist, my role is to find the best way to get the message through. And lately, this is involved, of course, the use of sound material and audio. But I want to do a step back. So we all heard about data. Data are everywhere, especially in the last 2.5 years with the pandemic. We heard about percentages, cases, and so on. But what is data? So a definition from the Cambridge Dictionary says, and I'm going to read this, information, so data are information, especially facts or numbers, collected to be examined, considered, and used to help decision-making, or information in an electronic form that can be stored and used by a computer. Funny enough, I'm not a computer, but I still use data. And so I found another definition that works a little bit more with what I do. So for me, data are pieces of information about individuals organized in variables. And I intentionally say pieces of information and not, for example, numbers, because I strongly believe that data are not only numbers. So think about words, the social media feeds, photographies, sketches, everything, even people. Let's do an example. Let's take tattoos. So we all know what a tattoo is. Tattooing is a very old practice. But in the context of Britain and Australia, we saw an increase in this particular discipline in the 19th century, when many criminals got a lot of tattoos. And these tattoos had numerous meaning, from words of love, hope, pain, friendship, and of course, religion. But more than anything, as a voluntary procedure, of course, tattooing provides helpful information on non-elite voices that are otherwise difficult to locate in historical dataset. For example, the unheard voices and stories of criminal convicts in the 19th century. It was 2019 when the British Library commissioned me a series of data visualization artwork for an upcoming exhibition at the British Library, which of course was delayed for 2 years, Thank you, COVID. And it happened in April this year and ended a couple of weeks ago. So the British Library is doing an amazing job at digitalizing every issue of all the newspapers published in the UK since many years ago. And they created a digital archive of with a lot of data, and I was to handle some of this data set for this exhibition. So first, I started with this data set about tattoos. And the data set that I use comes from a research called the Digital Panopticon, and it contains the most extensive information about tattooing in the 19th century. In Britain and Australia, all digitally available. And we are talking about at least 60,000 convicts who described their tattoos in a database. So basically, 60,000 people who told their story to a stranger. The language explaining this tattoo is mixed, so there were no specific criteria to collect this data. Sometimes using short and vague phrases, and as a result, it can be very challenging to separate deliberate tattoos from other physical marks, for example, scars. But it wasn't impossible, so they created this huge data set which told the story of many people. And this is how the records, the database look like. So it's a data set made of images and sketches, no numbers. So another type of data that we can visualize are words. So, and this giant circle, and you're going to see so many circles in the next slides, is showing the distribution of the mention of the word tattoo from a representative selection of British newspaper. And each line here counts the total mention per year of the word tattoo, starting from 0 at the circle center and then moving towards the end of the circle. We notice some peaks and valleys in the data set. We start with basically no mention, and then there is a huge spike happening there. And it's nice to notice the stories behind the data. So why there is this huge spike is because there is a mistake. Someone typed a couple of more zeros on the keyboard. No, actually, between the 1871 and the 1873, there was an extensive reporting of the Thickborn Clement legal case, in which evidence from tattoos played an important role. Actually, it was evidence of a missing tattoo. And that caused the peak in the data set and also caused the incarceration of a man. So to tell stories using data kind of abstract and a difficult beast, I use a lot of visual metaphors. For many reasons, the main one is to make design and artworks more relatable to my audience. And the inspiration for this artwork was the celestial map of the sky, especially the old ones. Why? Because I'm talking here about crime. I'm going to talk about this later. And tattoos, so two words apparently very separated. So these are some of the images that I use as reference, and you can see actually how I mainly copied, but fine. So tattooing in the 19th century was viewed as evidence of brutality and crime. So we have a connection. So I paired the tattoos dataset with a few stats about crime in the Victorian era. Like, for example, the impact of punishments on the lives of 100,000 people sentenced at the Old Bailey in the 19th century. And the Old Bailey is the central criminal court of England and Wales. And here is shown the distribution over time of the indictments broken down by age group. So we see a little bit of age distribution over time. And the circles on the outer big circle represent the total number of indicted people each year. So even if we all believe that data can only come from number, I would say probably 75% of the data used to make this artwork came from images and words. So I use this case study as an introduction for the story that I want to tell you today, which is a story about a missing photograph. And I want to introduce this story talking about a very personal project, and this is the first time that I speak in public about this project, so please be nice. So I want to talk about you this work because helped me to use my skills to recreate lost memories and change how I live, work, and learn. This collection of works, it's called Necessity. It's a collection of 8 large-scale data visualization of not data numbers, but these are all visualization of sounds linked to my life. And this is how it started. In 2019, after a very long illness, unfortunately my father passed away. And I remember I was flicking through photographs and documents, memories, when I realized the only picture that I had with me was lost, was missing. And at the time I was very upset, and this absence just represented a new emptiness. But when working with data, for example, dealing with missing data or missing information or feeling stuck, it's very, very common. So I just started to do what I always done. And I remember that I read a few years ago a sentence, an article from an American journalist called Ezra Klein, that he said that especially as information and incremental developments explode in quantity, there is an increasing public hunger for understanding, not so much what happened, but what it means. And especially this sentence resonated a lot with me, which says it's less about producing new information, but gathering information already on record. So I thought, what can I do then? Can I just cry in the corner because the only picture that I wanted to have is lost? Or maybe I can make one? How? I don't know. So I decided to focus more on this direction. And then you soon see why this is what it is becoming. So the process to get there, it wasn't very easy. It was a little bit of a roller coaster because, of course, you get an idea, but then it's very difficult to make it happen. And so I have a background in this industrial design. I have a BA in industrial design. I studied how to design and create objects, basically. But more than everything, I studied design system, a design method. And studying industrial design has been extremely important for my work now as data visualization designer, because it showed me that good design is the first and foremost synonym for functionality. And that is very important when you visualize data. The work that you do has to be functional. And then I bumped into a Master of Science in Communication Design at the Polytechnic of Milan in Italy, where I graduated. Was 2 years very intense course, completely dedicated on data visualization. And it was many years ago when data visualization wasn't so cool as it is now. And study there for 2 years taught me how to shape a message to give the proper form to an idea. So I mentioned before that I teach data visualization at London College of Communication and Chelsea College of Art. And when I do so, I always try to find the right balance between form and function, combining the aesthetically pleasing aspect of information design with, of course, the functional and purpose-driven elements of statistics to create meaningful artifacts. And ultimately, the goal is always to help people to understand the world. But what I'm trying to do now is more shifting the focus on the meaning of our messages, because we are flooded of percentages, number, charts, but data literacy is so low that probably the public don't fully understand what statisticians are saying. So it's good to show our audience the impact that this data, this number have on their lives, what they really means to them. So going back to the missing photograph, I wanted to overcome this lack of data by reusing information already available. And I want to explain them and contextualizing them. So as a data visualization designer, most of the work that I do, the 80%, is actually only research and sketching. All the sexy colors and shapes, they come very, very late, at very late stage. So I approached this situation as I would approach any other project. So I started doing some research. And in 1912, the British art critic Roger Fry coined a term, the term visual music, to describe the abstract work of the painter Vasily Kandinsky. And by the way, Kandinsky, he wasn't only a talented painter, but he was also a talented musician. So here the first light bulb popped in. I thought, oh, there is a link between art and music. That's interesting. For him, the emotional power of music provided inspiration for abstract paintings that use line, shapes, colors, dots, all the kind of geometry to produce a visual link between music and visual representation. But he wasn't the only one. And more recently, for over 40 years, the music pioneer and producer Brian Eno explored the complex relationship between light and sound. It was interesting as well, light and sound. He pursued a career in visual arts that have developed together with his work as a musician. So I already had two evidences of maybe this idea is coming from something that has a solid base. And then life happened, pandemic and so on, moving forward to 2020. And out of all the negativity of that year, it happened that I crossed paths with a Berlin-based duo of DJs and music producer. And I'm really happy to be here today in their own city to talk about this collaboration. So they run an independent record label here in Berlin. It's called Summer Over Histories. And they produce electronic techno music. And they approached me because they saw some of my work on Instagram, and they say, oh, this artworks looks very cool. Can we get some for the cover of some of our records? I said, wow, that's cool. I never done something like that before, never played with music, sound, interesting. I said, yeah, but you need to know that all these works are not random. They're all unique because they all come from data. So fine, accept this challenge, but give me some time because I need to understand how to get this happen. So first of all, I decided to settle on a shape. And my research started, of course, with the work of Vasily Kandinsky, but for a reason. And he was obsessed with the geometry, especially with the shape of the circle. And he said that the circle is the synthesis of the greatest opposition. It combines the concentric and the eccentric in a single form and in equilibrium. Sounds very fascinating. And here you can see some of the data-driven record cover that I've done for the record label. They change a lot in style and shape. There is always a little bit of recurring element of the circle, even if sometimes comes in different shapes, like a network diagram or a density plot. And what you see here visualized are some metrics that are naturally included in every song that we hear, like amplitude, frequency, spectrum. You just are seeing them in a different way. I produced almost 15, maybe more, data-driven album covers during this year that I'm doing this collaboration. Sometimes records, sometimes digital releases, sometimes proper printed actual physical products, sometimes tape cassettes. And I'm incredibly grateful for this collaboration for many reasons, but specifically because it created the foundation for the Necessity collection. And of course, I've never learned to play an instrument, so I apologize for all the musicians in the room. But for me, it's extremely fascinating to see the explosion of colors, patterns, and shapes that comes from every track. And I started to associate these shapes and this color with the emotions and the feeling that I was experiencing while listening to these songs. And the process is pretty much always the same. I receive the tracks, I sit down in front of my laptop, put my headphone on, I listen to these songs. And I listen them in different moments of my day. When I walk, when I exercise, when I try to relax. And I try to write down the emotion that come from listening to these songs. Then I pick one, the one that I like the most. And then through a different audio manipulation software, I extract this information and then I visualize them. By the way, I don't code, I don't use any script. This is all done manually, which is a very long and time-consuming exercise, but it's the best part of this job, where you spend hours just crafting all the single details, moving things a little bit, or maybe changing the color, adding a blur. Oh, it's a very satisfying moment. That lasts weeks, but still satisfying. So what it started as a very random process, in that kind of randomness, I found something that made sense. So I kept doing these works for years. And I got a lot of visibility, and a lot of clients got in touch with me because they've seen these works, and then we did some data sonification about more very different topics. But I felt that something was still missing. Maybe something was missing because I was using a material that wasn't mine. So I was using songs that someone else made. And in the back of my mind, there is always this fact of that missing photograph. So what can I do? So I decided, well, maybe I could start using the same process by focusing on sounds linked to my life. And now I'm going to introduce, finally, the work Necessity, which, by the way, this is one of the details of these prints, which are 1 meter by 1 meter, very big. So as part of my life and also a way how my mind works, I keep track of everything. And for everything, I pretty much mean everything. I write down notes, I take pictures, I record sounds, obviously. But I've done that unconsciously since I was a child. And only quite recently, after other type of journeys, I realized that I made a job out of my necessity. That was interesting. And I record my breathing while sleeping, for example. I use an app on my iPhone that I run every time I go to bed, which records, also the quality of your sleep, how many hours you slept, and so on. I record the sound of a walk in the park, or when I go for a run, I don't listen to music, but I record the rhythm of my steps. Don't judge me. I record moments with my partner, memories, and I use these sounds to map emotions. All these sounds are linked to emotions. So I'm creating an audio-visual diary of my life. I map restlessness, grief, passion, loneliness, all the kind of emotions. So I call this work Necessity because this work begins with data, of course, audio, and is produced through a condition of necessity. It's just my lifeline. I couldn't do anything else. And the roots of my practice were formed in my childhood, and this was something I became aware a few months ago. And where from the early years, I began working recursively, creating a single sketch daily that connected with my emerging personhood. And I was doing this in primary school. I remember I have at home at my parents' house this huge stack of small squared sketches that I was doing when I was from 3 to 6 years old. This was an exercise that my educators called presenza, which in Italian means presence. And this, since a very early age, represented an unconscious approach to the movement of quantified self, which, well, kind of rationalized what I always done, and I found this name. So quantified self is a movement that where people record data, stats about their life, calorie intake, steps, things like that. And for example, you know, I just connected all the dots after all these years, and it was a kind of epiphany when I started to remember that, oh my God, I've done this for my entire life, even without realizing it. It was 2014 when I initiated this kind of data art experiment when I tracked and recorded the movement of the mouse while I was working on the laptop over 12 months every day. And I created a series of 250 different graphics, which they look like this, but this is a collage of a month worth of recording. And you can see every dot is a pause, a break, and every line is a proper movement. At the bottom, there are the apps on the dock that I use the most. You can see the line at the top is me moving towards the bar of Illustrator or other software. And documenting my life has always been a thing for me. What I did recently was just putting all these things together and connecting all these dots, literally. So this work and research focusing, exposing the self through art making, have remained foundational to my production. Only recently, with the help of some professional, I discovered that this work is tied to a mental landscape of OCD. And is created as an antidote for me to obsessive cycles. And this manifests differently across different type of project, but systematically begins with a recording process and ends with an interpretive one. So the recording phase starts with an introspective trigger, mostly moments when I feel particularly anxious. And where my mind goes is to stay busy doing a ritual, taking notes, recording stuff, doing quick sketch and things like that, listing numbers, you name it. I record every type of things that happens in my life. I record, for example, actions, my movement and breath as I walk through places. I record relationships, memories shared with my partner. I record unconscious behaviors, what happens when I'm going to bed. But do you remember the missing photograph, how everything links to this? So, well, as I use sound to map emotions, I thought that in order to recreate that missing photograph, I could use information already on records. And then I thought that my father used to do many public speaking. So I thought there must be some records somewhere. So I went to YouTube and I found an interview that he did. So I thought, wow, that's data. I can do something. And this is a detail of the artwork. So I decided to visualize our two voices together. So the piece is made of two circles, and each circle represents one voice. So the audio is taken from these recordings, done, of course, in two different situations, 2 different years, separately. And I joined them together. So I went through my process, I listened to the sound, I clipped the audios, I run through a series of software to extract the waveform, and I finally create a composition, which is made of 2 circles, which do resemble a little bit the infinite sign, not intentional. So the circle here show the amplitude of our voices and the density of the circle. You can see some is more spiky, some here is a little bit less detailed. shows the length of the audio clip. And as information designer, nothing is random, so not even the colors of these artworks are random. So in the necessity collection, all the artworks, which are 4 unique visualization, comes in 2 different colors, a dark version and a light version. That is to respect, to kind of communicate a sense of ambivalence. And the colors for both of them, this one, for the dark one, I took it from a picture of the sea. I come from Genoa. It's kind of a smallish town, northwest of Italy. It's a town on the seaside, very nice and lovely. And my father and I loved sea. I used to sail. I sailed for many, many years, so I'm really connected to the sea. And then the colors come exactly from that picture. And that one represented the sky with the 2 circles that create a kind of lens flare, like when you look at the sky on a sunny day. And in Genoa, it's mostly sunny most of the year. So the process behind the works, all the works in the necessity collection, begins with an interpretive phase, of course, and then becomes a translation of the metrics into 2-dimensional forms. So as you remember at the beginning, I said that data sonification starts from a numerical data set, an Excel file, and translate that into sound. But I do reappropriate the term and I actually start from the sound and I make that tangible, visible. And this is often expressed in the circular elements, because it's a shape that I like particularly, that I always use in any form for the design that I made. I'm inspired by the work of Kandinsky, of course. And circles are formed, if you think about a circle, how it's made, geometrically speaking. Circles are formed by a sequence of thousands of tiny points that merge into one curved line. And there is a kind of hidden pressure pushing them from the center to the edge as they support one another. These points represent the data points that I gather in my recording process. So all the notes that I take, all the number that I list, all the picture that I take to document my life. And this invisible tension, of course, replicated the tension within my mental journey. And once again, occupying that old concept of presence, of that exercise that I was doing when I was a child. So I want to show you now a little bit in details, more in details, what each artworks of the necessity collection shows. So this is the first one, and it's called Victoria. It's called Victoria because the audio recorded to make this visualization was recorded in a park in London called Victoria Park. It's in East London, near where I live. And going for a walk in the park was one of the only activity that was allowed during lockdown in London. So you could see many people walking in the park. And that day I was feeling a little bit meh, so I said, well, I'll go out for a walk. And I started my recorder, and you can hear the sound of human activity, bird songs, the wind through the leaves of the trees. 2 people are heard speaking in a friendly conversation in German, actually. Others walk by and become part of the white noise characteristic of an outdoor stroll. This is the light version. And this is soundscape converted. This is a pilot piece of the entire collection. It was the first one that I did, which I didn't like it, of course, because I never like what I do. And its formal characteristic actually resembled the section of a tree. So I tried here to use a visual analogy as well. So this intricate pattern is trying to mimic that. The second artwork is called Stay There. It represents the proximity of 2 lovers, where the ring do not signify 2 different and separated waveforms, but embody the physicality of 2 bodies and sets of breathing. And this is the other version with a different color approach. And here, blur frequencies emblematize their intertwining motion, and this is amplified with this deep red that stains the canvas. Recording breath as an investigation of the pattern of a restless sleeper, like I am. This is called Morpheus, and chronicles the verbal markers and rhythms of the duration of one night sleep. And this becomes a sample to understanding the habitual sleeping patterns, or maybe questioning whether external noise trigger a moment of waking or whether it's merely the provocation of the conscious mind. And here the circle is broken, and it's broken for a reason, because I don't sleep very well. I tend to wake many times during one night, so I thought maybe we need to break the circles for that reason. I would like to close the presentation mentioning another artist that was very important for the work that I do, which is Mark Lombardi. Mark Lombardi was a neo-conceptual American artist, and he made a lot of big artworks showing relationship and abuses of powers between corporations, politicians, government, and countries, mapping flows of money, power, information. And he was gathering all these data information just by reading books. And he every time he was reading books about current affairs, he was writing on some index cards every time a name popped up. And he created a huge archive of 14,000 index cards. And he used those data to create this beautiful network diagram done with pencil on paper. Incredibly easy. And there is a documentary on his life and his work. And he was asked to describe what he does, why did this kind of complicated diagrams, what he was trying to achieve. And he said that I was searching for a vehicle that would have the graphic impact of a painting, but that could convey a story. And I found that resonated a lot with all the work that I've done for Necessity Collection. But more than everything, he said that it's all public information, I'm just reprocessing it. And this is exactly what I've done for my entire life. I just use information that exists without creating new one, but just reprocessing them in a way that makes sense to me. That's all I have. Thank you so much.